Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. I'm going to start today with a 30-second pitch. And it might just break your brain. We're going to explore the idea that the chair you're sitting on doesn't actually exist. That you, the person listening to this, might be a completely different entity than you were 10 years ago. And most provocatively, that God, or at least the concept of hearing the divine, might have been a psychological software update that human beings installed only about, 3,000 years ago. We are looking at a collision between physics, atheism, and the hard problem of consciousness. And to help us navigate this existential minefield, we're diving into a heavy-hitting conversation between the philosopher and podcaster Alex O'Connor and, well, the internet's favorite science teacher, Michael Stevens from Vsauce. It's a deep dive into reality, identity, and the very architecture of belief.
It is, and I'm not exaggerating, an ontological adventure. We aren't just asking how things work, we're asking what things are. And what's fascinating is how quickly this conversation moves from, simple physics right into the territory of theology and atheism. They're deconstructing the objects around us, questioning the existence of the soul, and exploring a theory that suggests human consciousness as we know it, that inner voice you hear right now, is a recent invention that replaced what we used to call the voice of God.
It sounds incredibly heavy, but I love that they start this discussion in the most mundane place possible.
A fast food soda fountain.
Exactly.
Right. It starts with this debate about British versus American Dr. Pepper, but Michael Stevens uses it to just crack open the door to nihilism. He brings up the soda fountain scenario. You're filling your cup, mixing the syrup with the carbonated water.
Sure, you're trying to get that perfect ratio so it's not too watery.
Exactly. But Michael poses a metaphysical problem. If you start messing with that ratio, if you crank up the syrup way, way past the recommended amount, at what point does it legally or, philosophically cease to be Dr. Pepper and just become cherry-flavored sugar sludge?
I feel like I have definitely crossed that line at a movie theater before. But it's the soul rights paradox, right? The heap of sand.
That's it.
If you remove one grain, it's still a heap. You remove another, it's still a heap. But eventually you've got one grain left. So when did the heap die?
Precisely. The boundaries are fuzzy, and this leads them directly to the apple paradox. We tend to think of objects as these solid, almost divine creations. An apple is an apple because God or nature made it an apple. But Michael breaks reality down into levels. Level 1, the ingredients. Apple.
Okay, that makes sense.
Level 2, chemicals like iron, water, sugar.
Right, standard chemistry.
But level 3, it's just subatomic particles. Quarks, electrons, mass. And here's the kicker. If you look at a packet of processed artificial fruit snacks at that fundamental level, the ingredients are exactly the same. It's all just quarks and electrons spinning around.
So wait, at the bottom of reality, there is no difference between a natural, red, delicious apple and a gummy bear.
Fundamentally, no. The universe doesn't distinguish between natural and artificial, and this introduces the core concept of the entire discussion, which has huge theological implications. Mereological nihilism.
Mereological nihilism. That sounds like a philosophy that would get you burned at the stake in the 14th century.
It might have. Mereology is the study of parts and wholes. So mereological nihilism is the view that composite objects, tables, chairs, churches, even human bodies do not strictly exist.
They don't exist.
Right. There are no chairs. There is only stuff arranged chair-wise.
Stuff arranged chair-wise. I have to push back on this. If I stub my toe on a table, the pain is real. The bruise is real. How can Michael Stevens, a guy who loves science, say the table isn't real?
Well, he admits he leans toward this view. He believes the stuff, the matter and energy is real. But he thinks the nouns we use, like chair or table, are fictions. They're just arbitrary boundaries we humans draw around a cloud of atoms.
And if you apply that to religion, it gets spicy.
Very.
If chairs don't really exist, do temples exist? Do sacred objects exist?
Or are they just matter arranged holy-wise by human intention?
That is a very slippery slope. He uses the bikini example to illustrate this, right? Which was funny, but also kind of broke my brain.
It's a great example of how arbitrary our labels are. A bikini is considered one object. You buy a bikini, but the top and the bottom do not touch. They are spatially separated. So if you take the top off, leave it in your car, and walk onto the beach wearing just the bottoms, when does it stop being a bikini?
That's tricky. Because the universe doesn't care about fashion. We just decided those two pieces of fabric are one thing.
Exactly. Michael's point is that it depends entirely on context and human intention. It's art, not science. We are hallucinating order onto a chaotic universe. We look at a cloud of atoms and say, that is a table, or that is a statue of a deity. but the universe just sees atoms.
This brings us to a philosopher they discuss, Peter Van Inwagen, who tries to save us from this nihilism with a view he calls organicism. He tries to draw a hard line on when stuff actually becomes an object.
Right, and Van Inwagen argues that stuff doesn't form a new unified object unless it is alive.
So only living things are real objects.
Yes, because living things have a unified purpose survival, homeostasis. A table doesn't care if it falls apart, a dog does. But this leads to a ridiculous conclusion. A conclusion which Van Inwagen actually accepts. People exist, but they don't wear clothes.
Wait, I'm sorry. People exist, but they don't wear clothes.
Because clothes are inanimate, they're just stuff arranged clothes-wise. So, logically, according to this view, you are a real object, but your shirt is just a cloud of atoms hovering near your skin.
I'll remember that next time I'm underdressed. I'm not naked. This is just air arranged pants-wise. But why do we do this? If these labels aren't technically real, why do we have this desperate need to label everything?
Evolution. And this is where the atheist perspective often comes in, looking for biological reasons for our beliefs. Michael explains that humans are physically weak. We don't have claws or armor. Our survival niche is meaning. We create meaning to process data quickly.
Meaning as a survival tool.
Exactly. We group atoms into the word horse, not because horse is some divine category, but because it packs survival data into one word. Can I write it? Can I eat it? And you can apply the same logic to religion. We might group events into miracles or curses, not because that's the physics of it, but because it helps us survive and form cohesive groups.
So we aren't seeing reality. We're seeing a user interface. Icons on a desktop designed to keep us alive.
That is the perfect analogy. And this fluidity of identity applies to digital things too. They discuss the Ship of Theseus paradox using the Wikipedia page for the Ship of Theseus.
Which has been edited thousands of times. No original sentence remains. Is it the same page?
Identity is all about context. But here's where we pivot to the most controversial part of this whole thing. We've established that chairs might not be real. But what about you? Are you just stuff arranged host-wise?
This is where the conversation really starts to challenge the religious concept of the soul, isn't it?
It really does. They talk about the 5-year-old problem. Medically, you are the same organism as you were at 5. But if you met your 5-year-old self, you'd be total strangers. Michael argues that we prioritize psychological continuity over the physical stuff.
And they use that dark thought experiment, the clone torture paradox. This really highlights the difference between a soul and just data.
It's a terrifying scenario. Imagine a mad doctor swaps your memories and your mind with your worst enemies. So your mind is now in your enemy's body and their mind is in your body. Then the doctor says, I am going to torture one of these bodies. You choose which one.
So my consciousness, I'm sitting in my enemy's body. If I say torture my original body, I'm safe.
Right. And Michael argues almost everyone would choose to torture their original body to save their current consciousness. This implies we don't identify with the meat. We identify with the software.
But then what is that software? Is it a soul given by God? Or is it just a user illusion?
And this is the perfect bridge to the most mind-blowing part of their talk.
The bicameral mind.
The bicameral mind. This touches directly on the origins of God and the nature of atheism.
Okay, so lay it out for us. What's the theory?
This is from Julian Jaynes, and it's fascinating. Michael explains that humans might not have possessed interiority, an inner monologue, that voice in your head, until as recently as 1000 BC. Before that, the theory goes, the brain was bicameral, or two-chambered. One part spoke and the other part obeyed.
So when you say one part spoke, what did the person actually hear?
They heard a voice, and they didn't think, oh, that's just me thinking. They interpreted that voice as a god.
This is huge.
Yeah.
So the theory suggests that the ancient gods were actually just hallucinations caused by the structure of the primitive brain.
Exactly. It presents a naturalistic, you could say atheistic explanation for the origin of religion. Look at the Iliad. It's one of our oldest texts. The characters do not decide things. Achilles doesn't sit down and think, should I fight? A god appears and tells him to fight. Jaynes argues they experience their own volition as an external command from a deity.
That completely reframes religious history. So essentially, ancient humans were walking around lacking free will, hallucinating commands, and calling it divine intervention.
That's the theory. And by the time you get to the Odyssey, which was written later, characters have wily minds. They have internal motives. Jaynes argues that as language became complex and societies got too big, the God voice stopped being effective. The brain reorganized. We developed the software of being a person inside a head. We internalized the God voice, and it became me.
They mention dreams in ancient texts, too, which supports this.
Yes. In ancient writings, people didn't say, I had a dream. They said, a dream came to me. It was an external visitation. The implication is staggering. Consciousness, this feeling of being a self, separate from the world, might be a learned cultural software, not some biological constant given by a creator.
It makes you wonder, if we learned to be conscious individuals, could we learn something else? Are we still running beta software?
That's the question. And Michael is very skeptical of free will in general. He views the I that makes decisions as a user interface illusion created by a non-conscious brain. In his view, there's no driver in the seat, just a brain reacting to physics.
Which is a very deterministic atheist worldview, but then right at the end, they throw a curveball that feels almost spiritual, but in a scientific way. Panpsychism.
This is where they discuss the limits of science. Michael points out that science is great at describing what happens, but terrible at explaining why. Newton could predict gravity, but he admitted he had no idea what gravity was.
The classic God of the gaps.
Exactly. And to fill that gap, they discuss Philip Goff's panpsychism. This is the idea that consciousness isn't something that magically pops up in brains. It's a fundamental property of matter, like mass or charge.
So, electrons are conscious.
Not that they're thinking about philosophy, but that there is something it is like to be an electron, a tiny rudimentary spark of experience.
This is interesting because it's not theistic.
Yeah.
It's not a guy in the clouds, but it's not fully materialist either. It's saying the universe is mind.
It creates a sort of spiritual atheism in a way. If every atom has a tiny spark of consciousness, then we aren't just biological machines, we're complex arrangements of the universe experiencing itself. But it raises the combination problem. How do billions of tiny electron minds combine to make one human mind?
It's the Empire State Building analogy. How do a million bricks make a skyscraper?
Right. But as Michael points out, the materialists have the same problem. How does dead, non-conscious matter combine to make a mind that feels love? Whether you believe in a soul, a bicameral hallucination, or panpsychism, consciousness remains the ultimate mystery.
So let's wrap this up. We've dissolved the chair you're sitting on into a cloud of quarks. We've questioned if yourself is just a memory file. We've considered the possibility that God was a voice in the right hemisphere of the brain that we eventually muted.
It's a lot to process. But the big takeaway for me is that our view of the world objects, gods, selves, it's a user interface. It's a story we tell ourselves to survive. It's not necessarily the truth with a capital T.
It's humbling. We're navigating a mystery with a map drawn by our ancestors, one originally designed just to help us hunt and gather, which we're now using to try and understand the cosmos.
Beautifully put.
I want to leave you with one final thought. If the theory is right, and consciousness, this inner voice we cherish, is just a piece of software we learned 3,000 years ago, what is the next update? As we merge with AI, as we move away from traditional religion, will we evolve a new form of consciousness? Will the God voice return, or will we become something entirely new?
That is a thought that will keep me up tonight.
Me too. Thank you for thinking deeper with us today.